The exception to National Electrical Code Section 110.26 Vernier addresses working clearances for electrical equipment. This exception applies to enclosed accessible spaces that are dedicated to electrical equipment and are not intended for continuous human occupancy. Let's explore examples of installations that would comply with this exception. Firstly, electrical rooms. These are rooms where electrical equipment is installed and maintained, such as switchgear rooms, transformer vaults, and uninterruptible power supply or UPS rooms. Secondly, panel board rooms. These are rooms where electrical panels are located and are accessible for maintenance and operation. Thirdly, cable vaults. These are underground or in building spaces where cables are terminated and interconnected. Fourthly, vertical shafts. These are vertical enclosures dedicated to electrical distribution, such as cable trays, conduits, and busways. Fifthly, interstitial levels. These are spaces between floors that are used exclusively for the passage of electrical and mechanical services. To qualify for this exception, several requirements must be met. The space must be enclosed and accessible only to qualified electrical personnel for maintenance and repair purposes. The space must not be intended for continuous human occupancy, such as offices, workspaces, or equipment rooms used for other purposes. The space must be properly ventilated to prevent the accumulation of heat and smoke. The space must have adequate lighting for safety and maintenance. Now, let's consider how this exception might apply to a specific project, for example, an interstitial level containing piping, ducts, and panel boards. To determine if the exception applies, the following conditions must be met. Firstly, the interstitial level must be enclosed and accessible only to qualified electrical personnel. This means access should be restricted to individuals trained and authorized to work on electrical equipment. Secondly, the space is not intended for continuous human occupancy, such as storage or office space. The primary purpose of the interstitial level should be for housing and servicing electrical and mechanical systems, not for regular human activities. Thirdly, the space must be properly ventilated to prevent overheating. Adequate ventilation is crucial to dissipate heat generated by electrical equipment and maintain a safe operating temperature. Fourthly, the space has adequate lighting for maintenance and inspection. Sufficient lighting is necessary to ensure that electrical personnel can safely and effectively perform maintenance and inspection tasks. If all of these conditions are met, the contractor can take advantage of the exception and install electrical equipment without the need for a working space of 3 feet in front of the electrical equipment and a 30-inch clearance on the sides and back, which is required under normal circumstances. This can be particularly beneficial in situations where space is limited. Let's delve deeper into each of these requirements to provide a comprehensive understanding of how to apply the exception correctly. Enclosure and accessibility only to qualified personnel. The space must be physically separated from other areas by walls, floors, and ceilings. Access points, such as doors or hatches, should be secured to prevent unauthorized entry. Signage should be posted to clearly indicate that the area is restricted to qualified electrical personnel only. Qualified electrical personnel are individuals who have the skills and knowledge related to the construction and operation of the electrical equipment and installations and have received safety training to recognize and avoid the hazards involved. These individuals should be familiar with relevant electrical codes and standards and be capable of performing maintenance and repair tasks safely. No continuous human occupancy. The space should not be used for any activities that require regular or prolonged presence of people. Examples of prohibited uses include offices, workstations, storage areas for non-electrical equipment, or break rooms. The space should only be accessed for maintenance, inspection, or repair of electrical equipment. The determination of whether a space is intended for continuous human occupancy is based on the design and intended use of the space. If the space is designed or equipped for activities that require regular human presence, it is considered to be intended for continuous human occupancy, even if it is not always occupied. Proper ventilation. Adequate ventilation is essential to prevent the accumulation of heat generated by electrical equipment. Overheating can lead to equipment failure, reduced efficiency, and increased risk of fire. The ventilation system should be designed to provide sufficient airflow to dissipate heat and maintain a safe operating temperature. The specific ventilation requirements will depend on the amount of heat generated by the equipment, the size of the space, and the ambient temperature. Natural ventilation, such as vents or louvers, may be sufficient in some cases. However, mechanical ventilation, such as fans or air conditioning, may be necessary in other cases, particularly for larger spaces or spaces with high heat loads. The ventilation system should be designed to comply with applicable building codes and standards. Adequate lighting. Sufficient lighting is necessary to ensure that electrical personnel can safely and effectively perform maintenance and inspection tasks. The lighting system should provide adequate illumination to allow workers to clearly see equipment, wiring, and other components. The lighting should be evenly distributed to avoid shadows and glare. The specific lighting requirements will depend on the size of the space, the type of equipment, and the nature of the tasks being performed. As a general guideline, the lighting level should be at least 10-foot candles or 107.6 lux measured at the working surface. The lighting system should comply with applicable building codes and standards. The use of the exception to National Electrical Code Section 110.26 FERNIA can offer significant benefits in terms of space utilization and cost savings. However, it is essential to ensure that all of the requirements are met to maintain electrical safety and comply with applicable codes and standards. Failure to comply with these requirements can result in hazardous conditions, equipment damage, and code violations. It is important to consult with qualified electrical engineers or inspectors to determine if the exception is appropriate for a specific installation and to ensure that all of the requirements are met. In the specific scenario of an interstitial level with piping, ducts, and panel boards, careful consideration should be given to the layout and organization of the space. The panel board should be located in a manner that allows for safe and easy access for maintenance and inspection. The piping and ducts should be arranged in a way that does not obstruct access to the panel boards or create hazards. The interstitial level should be kept clean and free of debris to prevent tripping hazards and to facilitate maintenance and inspection. Regular inspections should be conducted to ensure that the space is being properly maintained and that all of the requirements of the exception are being met. Any deficiencies should be promptly addressed to prevent potential problems. To summarize, the exception to National Electrical Code Section 110.26 FERNIA provides a valuable alternative to the standard working clearance requirements for electrical equipment in dedicated spaces. By carefully adhering to the requirements of the exception, it is possible to create safe and efficient electrical installations in spaces that are not intended for continuous human occupancy. Remember that qualified electrical personnel must perform all work, and regular inspections and maintenance are essential to ensure ongoing compliance and safety. Let's now consider some additional points related to this exception to provide a more complete understanding. Firstly, the definition of qualified electrical personnel is crucial. The National Electrical Code defines qualified electrical personnel as those who have the skills and knowledge related to the construction and operation of the electrical equipment and installations and have received safety training to recognize and avoid the hazards involved. This definition is broad and encompasses a range of individuals, including licensed electricians, electrical engineers, and trained maintenance personnel. The specific qualifications required will depend on the type of equipment and the nature of the work being performed. It is the responsibility of the employer to ensure that all electrical personnel are properly qualified and trained. Secondly, the concept of continuous human occupancy requires careful interpretation. The National Electrical Code does not provide a specific definition of continuous human occupancy. However, the intent of the code is to prohibit the use of spaces that are intended for regular or prolonged human presence. As mentioned earlier, examples of prohibited uses include offices, workstations, storage areas for non-electrical equipment, or break rooms. The determination of whether a space is intended for continuous human occupancy is based on the design and intended use of the space. If the space is designed or equipped for activities that require regular human presence, it is considered to be intended for continuous human occupancy, even if it is not always occupied. Thirdly, the ventilation requirements should be carefully evaluated. The National Electrical Code does not provide specific ventilation requirements for spaces covered by the exception to Section 110.26 FONIA. However, the code does require that the space be properly ventilated to prevent the accumulation of heat and smoke. The specific ventilation requirements will depend on the amount of heat generated by the equipment, the size of the space, and the ambient temperature. It is important to consult with a qualified mechanical engineer to determine the appropriate ventilation system for a specific installation. The ventilation system should be designed to comply with applicable building codes and standards. Fourthly, the lighting requirement should also be carefully evaluated. The National Electrical Code does not provide specific lighting requirements for spaces covered by the exception to Section 110.26 FONIA. However, the code does require that the space have adequate lighting for safety and maintenance. As mentioned earlier, a general guideline is a lighting level of at least 10 foot candles or 107.6 lux measured at the working surface. The lighting system should comply with applicable building codes and standards. Fifthly, the exception to Section 110.26 FONIA should not be applied indiscriminately. The exception is intended for specific situations where the space is dedicated to electrical equipment and is not intended for continuous human occupancy. It is not a substitute for proper planning and design of electrical installations. In situations where the space is not truly dedicated to electrical equipment or where the space is intended for some level of human occupancy, the standard working clearance requirements of Section 110.26 should be followed. Sixthly, it is important to maintain proper documentation of the installation. The documentation should include drawings, specifications, and calculations that demonstrate compliance with the requirements of the exception. The documentation should be readily available for review by electrical inspectors and other authorities. Seventhly, regular inspections and maintenance are essential. The electrical installation should be inspected regularly to ensure that it is being properly maintained and that all of the requirements of the exception are being met. Any deficiencies should be promptly addressed to prevent potential problems. In addition to the points discussed above, it is also important to consider the following factors when applying the exception to National Electrical Code Section 110.26 FONIA. Firstly, the type of electrical equipment being installed. The type of equipment will affect the amount of heat generated, the ventilation requirements, and the lighting requirements. Secondly, the size and configuration of the space. The size and configuration of the space will affect the ventilation requirements and the lighting requirements. Thirdly, the ambient temperature and humidity. The ambient temperature and humidity will affect the ventilation requirements. Fourthly, the presence of other equipment or systems in the space. The presence of other equipment or systems in the space may affect the ventilation requirements and the lighting requirements. Fifthly, the applicable building codes and standards. The applicable building codes and standards will dictate the specific requirements for ventilation and lighting. By carefully considering all of these factors, it is possible to safely and effectively apply the exception to National Electrical Code Section 110.26 FONIA and create efficient electrical installations. Remember that electrical safety is paramount and that all work should be performed by qualified electrical personnel.